As the weather begins to get a little bit cooler, I think about some of the things that we would do in early fall as I was growing up. My brother and I would be sent out to pick the pears on the pear tree in the backyard. Now, if anybody has ever had fresh fruit fresh off the tree, whether it's pears or oranges or satsumas or apples or figs, there's nothing quite like it, is there? The very fresh ones just straight off the tree. And so every year, my brother and I would be sent out to pick the pears off the tree. And this one particular year, he was climbing a small ladder to pull down the pears, and I was taking the pears from him and putting them in the bucket. I'm about 6.5 years younger than him, so putting the pears in the bucket was a good job for me since he could climb it. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he starts screaming, "Run! Run!" And I opened my mouth, being the inquisitive child that I was, and I said, "Why?" And a live wasp flew inside my mouth and stung me. And I was about 7 years old. My brother was about 13, and he ran track, but I tell you, that day I outran him to the house. I think about those pears and the wasps. And what we know as adults is it's quite possible that the very wasp that stung me that day was the one that pollinated the tree so that we could have the pears, right? And I think about how that is like us in life, like us as adults, as people in life. That sometimes there's these little acts of kindness that we do that can turn into so much more. But every once in a while we sting each other, right? Anybody out there ever experienced a random act of kindness or an act of kindness? I think about how there was that big movement to do the random acts of kindness years ago, and how one time there wound up being over 200 cars in a line that paid for the coffee of the people behind them. And if we've ever received just one of those little random acts of kindness, it'll make us smile, right? And maybe we've had a chance to be a part of that. Anybody out there ever been stung by somebody? I think that's also true of all of us. What I think about as we continue our series this week that's based on Micah, especially Micah chapter 6, verses 6 through 8, I want us to think about kindness. But first, I want us to remember a little bit about how we started this series last week and what we have here. Now remember, the prophet Micah was written during a time in which the Israelite people were divided into two nations, and they were facing the possibility of being conquered by Assyria. They didn't really agree on a whole lot of things, and the prophet Micah came to them to give them warnings about what God's priorities were, what God wanted from them. And he comes to this in Micah chapter 6, verse 8. He has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? To do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. And last week we talked some about justice, about how so often, especially in our culture, we think about justice as being retributive, like somebody did something wrong and so we need to get them back. But about how God's justice, this concept of mishpat, which is in the Old Testament, that Hebrew word, is more about the distribution than it is about retribution. It's more about people having what they need in order to experience the fullness of life that God has for them. And so just as we studied last week that word for justice, this week I want us to study that word for kindness. That word for kindness. But part of what I want us to notice here is a word that comes before it. It says, what does the Lord require of you? Because so often when we think of kindness, we think of it as the little extra things, right? The little nice things that are on the side, the things that aren't required. But yet somehow in this text, God takes something so small, but requires it. God takes something that seems so small, but requires it, and requires kindness, requires justice, kindness, and humility. And I think about how in order for us to be able to experience the beauty of flowers, in order for us to be able to experience that opportunity to try that fruit fresh from the tree, there are those tiny acts that are done by those bees, by those wasps, by those birds, right? And so often we take that for granted because we don't see it. Unless we're watching closely, we don't see the little butterfly that lands on the flower, do we? Or we don't see the little things that are happening. And perhaps we don't see and we take for granted the little things that can help make our world such a brighter and such a more loving place. And I think about how so much of kindness is about taking time. So much of kindness is about taking time to do the little bit extra, to do the little bit more, to do the little things that matter. And I think about how we get into these big rushes, and especially when we're hurt, we want to be like I was the day that wasp stung me, and I wanted to run as fast as I could. And how, especially in our world today where we can be hurt so easily by others, it makes us sometimes want to run and not take the time to do the little act of kindness. Perhaps the act that is just listening before we come up with our response. And I'm preaching to myself, by the way, here too. I think about when we talk to each other, how often are we generating our response before we hear all of what the person has to say? How often are we reacting more than we're responding? Because the truth is that we can't control what other people do, but we have some control over what we do, right? We have at least some control over what we do. And that's part of what stood out to me in our epistle text for today. In that Colossians text, it says, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. Clothe yourselves. Now, clothing is one of those places in which we have some matter of choice. And now I don't mean just that we can go to our closet and decide, this is the outfit I'm going to wear. Clothing is something that we actually have a choice about much earlier in our life. Has anybody ever tried to put clothing on a 9-month-old that's writhing around and trying to get the clothes on them? We've got some parents of young children who are raising their hands. How about when they get a little bit older, when they're 2 years old and they can take their clothes off themselves? We have a choice when it comes to clothing, don't we? And we have that choice from the time that we are yay big. I remember my little niece, she'll kill me now, but my little niece when she was about yay big and she just decided to take all her clothes off at church one day. You know, we have a choice about what we wear as our clothing. And in this text, in this epistle text, it says, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. Now, when we look at that, those are not emotions. We don't always get to choose the emotions that we do. We get to choose how we respond. We can choose to be compassionate. We can choose to be kind. We can choose to be humble and to be meek and to be patient. And I think about how God has said that this kindness is a requirement. But what is that word, that word for kindness? Now, in the Old Testament, the word that has been translated kindness here is the word hesed. The word hesed, and it occurs in the Old Testament 250 times. 250 times. But it's not translated as a single word in English because there's not really a perfect equivalent. So sometimes it would get translated as love. And you see here it was loving kindness in the Micah 6:8 text. It gets translated as that concept of agape love, that selfless love. We also see it translated as concern, right? As concern, compassion, mercy, grace, which is that unmerited favor. It can also be a promise of loyalty. Loyalty is a choice, isn't it? And yet we see here that these are the things that are required. Now, when I think of a requirement, a lot of times I think, I really don't want to do that. Is it just me? Sometimes when something's required, it's like, I don't want to do it. But like the way that God created us, when God calls us to be kind, it benefits all of us. It benefits not only the person that we are kind to, but it benefits us. This past week, I heard a quote from Dr. Michelle Ropin, and she's a wellness coach, and she had done some research on kindness, and she discovers that kindness actually changes your hormones and well-being. It actually changes the hormones that are in your body, and it releases oxytocin. That's that bonding hormone, and it can lower our blood pressure. It can improve our sleep and our immune system, and it can lower our cancer risk. Just the act of being kind and of receiving kindness, both of them, hear me, not just receiving, but giving kindness, can lower our blood pressure, improve our sleep and our immune system, and lower our cancer risk. Perhaps when God required kindness of us, God knew what God was doing. That it would not only bring a smile to our face, but that it might bring a little bit of peace to our hearts. That it might bring a little bit more strength to our bodies. And kindness is a key component in relationships, whatever kind of relationship it is. I think about kindness, how in Proverbs chapter 20, verse 28, it talks about leaders having kindness. It talks about that a king's kingdom is built on kindness. It doesn't talk about it being built on a sword. And I think about how so often it is kindness that brings success. I want you to think for a moment about when you've gone to a store to purchase something. Are you more likely to go back to a store where they treat you with kindness? You might even be willing to drive a few extra miles to go to it, or pay a few extra cents or a couple of extra dollars because of the kindness that they offer. And I think about how in our world where there's so much disagreement, kindness is one of the things that most of us agree on. On September 27th, they were doing a political poll. Does anybody love answering political polls? I'm just kidding. But they were doing a political poll, and they found this one thing that 75% of Americans agreed about their political leaders. 75% of Democrats, Republicans, independents across the board agreed with the following statement. To restore peace and unity, we need leaders to model kindness and understanding. Even with people they strongly disagree with, leaders must show the way forward. I'm going to share this again. 75% of Americans in a study on September 27th agreed with the following statement. To restore peace and unity, we need leaders to model kindness and understanding. Even with people they strongly disagree with, leaders must show the way forward. Kindness. That kindness is one of the things that people across the political spectrum are looking for. Now, does kindness mean that you have to agree? No. Kindness means seeing the full humanity of a person and acknowledging that maybe you don't agree, but you can still treat them and respect them and be loving towards them. This past week, as I was considering this concept of kindness and how it has played out in the political world, I came across a story about Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill. Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill. Now, I remember President Reagan a little bit. I'll be honest, I don't remember Tip O'Neill, but that's not a political thing. That just has to do with my age. But they were political opposites. Some of you are looking and nodding that Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan were political opposites. They agreed about almost nothing politically. But after President Reagan had been shot, he only allowed certain people to come and visit him in the hospital. He made a specific list, and on that list was Tip O'Neill. And you might be surprised by that. But Tip O'Neill came to visit Ronald Reagan in the hospital, and you know what he did? He knelt by his bed and he prayed Psalm 23 for him. Tip O'Neill prayed Psalm 23 for President Reagan. And a few years later, after President Reagan had recovered, when Tip O'Neill got an award, guess who he asked to come and speak? President Reagan. Two people who disagreed about almost everything, who the world would say should not even talk to each other except when they had to, were there for each other to celebrate the good times and to help through the hard times. You know, it can be hard to pray for our enemies. I think about a few weeks ago, we came across that text that called us to pray for everyone. But what does it look like if we were to pray for our enemies? And that maybe when we didn't know the words to pray, we took Psalm 23 and prayed it over them. Use God's own words to pray for the shepherd. I think about how a few weeks ago we had this story about Jesus going and saving the one sheep out of to bring back to the 99. Do you think in a flock of 100 sheep that those sheep every once in a while get on each other's nerves? I'd imagine so. Hey, that was my grass to eat. You go over there. You know? I was about to jump into this creek right here. And yet, the shepherd is the shepherd of them all. What would it look like if we prayed that way? I remember years ago I had a practice, and I've started it back up in the past few months, but years ago I had the practice of, on a certain day of the week, praying for all the people that annoyed me. And it became known around the congregation which particular day that this was, and so there was this joke. If pastor texts you on this day of the week and says that she's praying for you, then she's annoyed at you. But I'll tell you that what happened with the praying, other than starting a joke in my church, was that I started to be a little less annoyed with them. Now, did it actually change our relationship? Not that much, but it changed me. And so, as I began to look at these people, and yes, pastors do get annoyed at people. We are human, too. As I began to look at them, I began to see them more as one of God's other sheep than as the one who, stepped on my hoof every once in a while, and to pray for them. What would it look like if we did that sort of act of kindness? What would it look like if we modeled kindness for our leaders? I think about how the leaders of our world, especially in a democracy like this, they come from the people. What would happen if all of us began to model kindness? If all of us began to follow this thing that God didn't suggest, that God required for us to be kind to each other? If we chose to clothe ourselves with it rather than fight against it? What would it be like if we lived out the words of that song that we sing sometimes? Let there be peace on earth. What comes next? And let it begin with me. What would that be like? And this week I thought especially about all the kindness that we received a year ago. All of the good things that came from places far flung that helped us, especially as we were recovering from Ida. And as I spoke with leaders of a couple of the churches that had helped us, of the Grace Church in Florida and of Christ Church in North Carolina, I talked to the associate pastor at Christ Church in North Carolina, and she says, I have power. She says the senior pastor doesn't. She says about half our congregation does and half of them don't. I couldn't reach the church in Florida because 150 churches in the Florida conference, they sustained quite a bit of damage. But they do have their mail being forwarded. And so today I want to offer us the opportunity to offer kindness back to them. And we may not be in a place right now where we can send them money like they sent us, but we are in a place where we can pray for them. We are in a place where we can send them notes or maybe cute little pictures drawn by our children. We can send them kindness, right? So on your way out today, there are note cards and the address of the two churches and stamps. And I want to encourage you to take 5 minutes, 10 minutes to write a little note or a little prayer for them, or to throw some, like I said, some children's pictures in for them. Or if you feel called, throw a $20 Walmart card in. We all know a little bit helps, a little act of kindness. As they were so kind to us, can we do this for them? Can we pray for them? Can we keep them in our hearts as they kept us in theirs? Most of us have never met them. The pastor in Florida I had never met. I met her online after Ida happened. The associate pastor at Christ Church, we went to seminary together. But the members of those churches, they didn't know us and they were kind. So let's be kind. But I also want to say there are enough notes out there that if you want to take another one and just write it to somebody else this week, another little kind note, go ahead and do that too. Think about those little things that you can do. The widow in the first story, she felt like she could do nothing. But yet, with God's power, she was able to do so much more than she ever could have asked or imagined. And God, by the power within us, can do far more. I think about all the things that honey can be used for and that tiny act of pollination. At Bell Chase, when I went to the children's sermon and I asked the kids if they liked honey, not a single one of them liked it. So I had to think on my feet and figure out, how am I going to go with this? But remember the things that honey does. When we're sick, it can help us feel better, right? It's in our cough drops. Honey is the only substance on earth that contains all the things needed for human life. And it's created by the tiny little bee. And 70 bees it takes to make that size of a jar of honey. We may not be able to fix the roof of the churches that helped us. But we can be one of the bees that helps fill their jar up, can't we? We can be one of the people that prays for them, that helps remind them part of what's so important to those in crisis, that you are not alone. That you are not alone. That you are loved. And that we have a God who is kind and calls us to be kind too. Thanks be to God. Amen.